Growing Up White. It's Weird. Book 1, Chapter 8, Cakes 2.0. Okay, Chapter 7 was the introduction to Cakes, my cake art. Cakes I made for bands and artists that came through the Philadelphia area back in Pennsylvania when I lived there. Okay, so here I am. I made a cake with the logo and the call letters of the rock station, the top rock station in town, WMMR. I bring it down to the station. I go into the reception area. I see the receptionist. Of course, she says, "How can I help you?" And I say something like this: "Hi, my name is Glenn. I like the station. I made this cake, and I want to make cakes like this for rock bands." She looked at me, again, like I was crazy, and maybe I was a little crazy. I know, probably more weird than crazy. She said, so it's not for anybody, it's for the station, and you want to make cakes for bands. I go, yep, that's it. She says, okay, have a seat, and I'll see if I can get someone to help you. Let's just make a long story short. I was in the lobby for about 2 hours. People would come out from the station, look at me, look at the cake, go back in. The guests would come by, check in, look at the cake, look at me, go back, and so on and so on. Finally, a gentleman by the name of Dick, who was also a weekend DJ and the music director there at the station, came out and started talking to me. I showed him the cake, told him what I wanted to do. He looked at me, puzzled at first. Then he realized that, hey, this could be a good idea. He says, look, we can't pay you. I go, that's okay. You don't have to pay me. I'll just make the cake, bring it down to the station, and give it to the band. So he said, okay, what we'll do is we'll give you some albums, some concert tickets, and some shirts. I go, okay, that sounds good. So he says to me, Sunday, Ted Nugent's coming to the station, so why don't you make a cake for him? So I looked at him, I said, sure, I'll come down. Sunday sounds good. A few days later, it's Sunday. I make a guitar lion cake for Ted Nugent, put Ted Nugent's name on it, put the station's letters on it, bring it down. Now this time, my girlfriend at the time, who would dump me soon after this, went with me. Go down to the station. They let me in. I go upstairs. I see Dick. He says, okay, wait over there. I'm actually in the radio booth where the DJs broadcast from, and Dick is going to interview Ted Nugent. So a little while later, Ted Nugent comes in with maybe his manager and somebody. Dick does the interview live right there on the air with me and my girlfriend watching. The interview is done. Dick says, this is Glenn. He made this cake for the station for you. Ted Nugent looks at me. He looks at the cake. He looks at me again. He sees I'm holding a camera, and he says, are you just going to stand there, or are we going to take a picture? So we take a picture with Ted Nugent. He was very, very nice. They leave. Dick says, thank you. He gives me some tickets. I leave. Now, my girlfriend really wasn't into rock music. So that night, I go to the concert with my younger brother. Okay, so here's the concert. Ted Nugent is headlining. He has 2 opening acts. We go to the Spectrum, which is the arena where the Philadelphia Flyers and 76ers play. And we have really good seats. I mean, really good seats. And so we're waiting. The first band that comes out is the Scorpions. The Scorpions open up, and they're a hard rock band from Germany who would go on to sell millions and millions of albums and become headliners in their own right. Then the next band is AC/DC, still with singer Bon Scott. One of the cool things they did during the show is Bon Scott picked up the guitarist Angus Young, put him on his shoulders while he was playing his guitar, ran up the stairs, around the outside walkway, down the stairs, and through the crowd as Angus Young kept playing his guitar solo. This was the Highway to Hell album tour. Sadly, Bon Scott would die after the tour, and later he was replaced by Brian Johnson. They would go on to sell millions and millions, if not tens of millions of records, headline arenas, stadiums, and festivals around the world. And depending on when you were listening to this, for at least the next 45 years. And just a quick note, the next time I saw the band with their new singer, Brian Johnson, they headlined an arena with the Scorpions opening up for them. Time for the headliner, Ted Nugent. Lights go down, lights come up. There's Ted Nugent standing on a stack of amplifiers. He has his headband, his hair is long, he has his guitar, he has no shirt on, he has these white pants on, he has some kind of animal tail hanging from him, and he leaps into the midair and onto the stage down from the top of those amplifiers. The crowd goes crazy. He's just wailing on his guitar. The rest of the band kicks in, and for the next 90 minutes, it's a nonstop rock and roll show. I didn't know his music, but just being there in that crowd with his fans made me a fan too. So the show's done, everyone's leaving. I get this idea, why don't I go back and say hi, right? I met him already at the station. So we go back around the back of the arena, and there's like an area where the band brings all their equipment in. There's a guard there. And I'm just standing there waiting, and I say hi to some people. No one really acknowledges me. And so maybe about 45 minutes go by. And then finally, a gentleman, I think a photographer, hears what I say, looks at me, says, okay, come with me. He leads me and my younger brother down the hallway, down another hallway, and into the dressing room. He says to Ted, hey, this guy said he made you cake. Ted looks at me, looks at the guy, said, oh yeah, we met earlier, come on in. So there I am with my younger brother backstage, hanging out with Ted Nugent and his band and some other people there. And we're there maybe 20, 30 minutes, and then everyone's done and we all leave. So that was my first experience making cake for a rock band, seeing the concert, going backstage, and then it got better and better after that. Next up at the radio station, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. He was on the Damn the Torpedoes tour. I made a cake for him, went down to the station, met Tom Petty, got a picture with him, and on it went like that. Sometimes I would take the cake to the venue and see the show. And sometimes I would go backstage, but sometimes I wouldn't. So I started thinking, I'm not getting paid. Maybe another station would like what I do. So I went over to the other rock station, WYSP. The cool thing about WYSP was their music director, Robin, she took a liking to me and introduced me to her boyfriend, Michael, who was the record promoter for Capitol Records. And this was when everything changed for me. Now, Michael said, I can give you albums, I can give you concert tickets, and backstage passes. So I didn't ask for money right away. And I know that people had been seeing my cakes backstage from the radio station. Now they saw the person who made the cake. And I wanted to show Michael what I could do. So he had a band coming to town, the Knack. The Knack was famous for the hit My Sharona from their debut album. And for what I understand, they changed the sound of the LA music scene with that album. So Michael gives me their album and some other albums, tells me the band's coming around to the Tower Theater. He wants me to make a cake. And I say, okay, but here's the cool thing. While all this was going on all the years, no record promoter, no radio station person ever told me what to make. They just trusted me that whatever it was, it would be impressive. For the Knack, I made a cake that looked like their album cover. which was a picture of the 4 band members. Now, I didn't get to see the show because it was sold out. It was crazy the amount of people who wanted to see them. But across the street, downstairs in a private room, they were having the after party. And there were people from radio stations and fans and record people all over the place. I see them bringing my cake down the stairs into the party. Michael introduces me to the band, and the lead singer, Doug, says to me, "You made that?" I said, "Yes, I did." And he says, "Very cool." That's all the payment that I needed to have. But I did start to get paid after that cake. It wasn't a lot right away, but it started to add up. And here is the key. Michael introduced me to his partner at EMI Records. See, EMI and Capitol were the same company. So I started doing cakes for Capitol and EMI. Then they introduced me to their other record promoter friends. When I got next to CBS, Columbia, Epic, that was, to me, the big time. I mean, look, Capitol Records, big enough. But when you go to Columbia, CBS, Epic, you're like on top of the world. Billy Joel, Bruce Springsteen, and on and on and on. Next, A&M Records. Then, one of my favorites, Rick from Elektra Records. And all these guys and gals had their own lives. I mean, they were just regular people. If you met them, there was nothing special about them. Just their job was to take their records to radio stations and promote them and try to get them on the air. And getting the record on the air would get people to listen to the band and buy the record. So besides touring and promoting the record, the big deal was to get the record on the radio. And you could reach thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of listeners. So that, for a record, was the key. And that was the big part the label's record promoter played. And as much as word got around, not all the labels cared for what I was doing. So in that case, I would go to the radio station, or I got to know the concert promoters. In Philadelphia, the big one was Electric Factory Concerts, and they promoted just about all the shows in that area. And I got to know the main guy and his assistant at that company. So if I wanted to make a cake and see the show, and I didn't know the record label guy, and the radio station wasn't interested, I would just contact him. And most of the time, he would give me a ticket or two and a backstage pass. I also got to know the other promoter in town, made a cake for him, and went to some of his shows. Then some club owners. One club in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, Emerald City, had been a disco. Then when disco died, it became a rock club. So I made a cake, met the owner. He liked what I did. And if I wanted to see a band, I would just make a cake, bring it over, and go see the show. And most of the time, meet the bands. And who are these bands? Well, I mentioned Ted Nugent. I mentioned Tom Petty. I mentioned the Knack. One of the bands I probably made the most cakes for, who started playing smaller theaters and graduated to large arenas, was Iron Maiden. I must have made about 5 cakes in total for them. And I'd seen how they progressed from the smaller theater up to the large arenas. And they were always super nice backstage. Their manager liked me. They remembered the cakes that I did every time they came around. And it just made me feel really good because, you see, besides me meeting these bands that I admired, it felt special to me, when they acknowledged and appreciated what I did, that was the icing on the cake. And yes, that pun was intended. While I did see hundreds of shows, made hundreds of cakes, I didn't always get to meet the artists, which was understandable because they might have been limited on time or they just weren't in the mood, which was totally cool with me. And look, I was getting paid. The record promoters loved what I did. I got tickets. I got free albums. So I was happy. I didn't have to meet everybody. But of the bands I did meet, here are some of them. I'll start with these smaller bands playing clubs and theaters. Some of them you might remember, and some never heard of. And this was in Philly, a major stop for any band. I already mentioned Iron Maiden, who started at theaters. I made cakes and met Joe Jackson twice for his album Look Sharp and I'm the Man. Moon Martin, Southside Johnny, George Thorogood, Clarence Clemens and his band when he did a solo record, apart from Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, Katrina and the Waves. Remember her hit, Walking on Sunshine? Oh, and here's a fun one. Blue Oyster Cult was doing a small club tour under the name of Soft White Underbellies. And I got to meet the singer and the guitarist, the Romantics, who had a huge hit with What I Like About You. Yeah, I'll bet you could start singing it right now. April Wine, The Motels, Asia, which was a supergroup, Gary Newman, who had a hit with the song Cars, and not just rock artists. I made cakes for Liberace, Peter Allen, Andre McCardle. These were all at the Valley Forge Music Center. Juice Newton, country artist, Buddy Rich, the great jazz drummer, Triumph, Fastway. And again, these are just some of the artists I made a cake for and got to meet. Now, some of the bigger artists. And this is between 1979 and 1988. And then a few years after that, when I moved away to LA, I came back and did a couple cakes while I was visiting my family. For example, the Rolling Stones Steel Wheels Tour. The promoter had me do a cake for them. David Bowie, Glass Spider Tour. And that's the second time I could meet David Bowie. The first time was Sirius Moonlight Tour. He was always so gracious to everyone around him. I didn't get a picture the first time, but I did meet him, and he liked my cake, and his team put a picture of my cake in their press book for the tour. And of course, he was one of my favorite all-time artists, and I love seeing him in concert. While I did make cakes for Bruce Springsteen, Billy Joel, Neil Diamond, all part of Columbia, I didn't get to meet them, which was cool with me. But funny thing is, when Clarence Clemens did his show at a small club, Bruce Springsteen came backstage. And again, I got great tickets to see the show. I got free records, and I was getting paid. So life was good. Although I wasn't connected with the Warner Brothers record promoter, I made a cake through the concert promoter and got to meet Stevie Nicks, Christine McVie, John McVie, and Mick Fleetwood on the Fleetwood Mac Tusk tour. And when Mick Fleetwood saw the cake, he said something like, "Scooter," which I guess was the dog on the cover. I made quite a few cakes for Queen, but they had a strict backstage. However, I did get to meet Brian May, and they were also one of my most favorite bands, and I had seen them 3 times in concert. And wow, what a show. Besides the band being as great as they were, Freddie Mercury, singer and showman, no one like him. Journey on the Escape Tour, the Doobie Brothers, REO Speedwagon, High Infidelity Tour with the huge hit, Keep On Loving You, Grace Slick, yes, the legendary Grace Slick, touring with Jefferson Starship, The Outlaws, Molly Hatchet, Billy Squire. I must have made at least 4 cakes for him. He had that huge hit, The Stroke, and 3 of my favorite bands, Foreigner, The Cars, and Cheap Trick. Loverboy, remember Working for the Weekend? I'm sure you can sing it right now. ZZ Top, Bob Seger. And these are just the ones I remember. I'm sure there were a lot more. Also remember, I'm going to community college and then on to the university while making these cakes. And sure, I'm living at home, but I'm also contributing to the home. The record promoters that I was making cakes for also had me make cakes for their friends and family. So I had a good little business going. But I realized, even though some people wanted me to open my own bakery or invest a little money into me, I wasn't interested in that. You see, I just loved making the cakes that I made. I didn't want to work at another bakery. I didn't want to own my own bakery. It was just cakes. That's all I enjoyed doing. Then, when I graduated the university with my second degree, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. For the most part, the last 2 years I was there making cakes, I would go down to the venue, drop off the cake early to the dressing room, not meet anybody, and not go to the concert. However, there were still some shows that I went to see. While I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, Robin, the music director from WYSP, and her boyfriend Michael had moved out to LA. So I kept in touch with both of them, and I thought, hey, maybe I could do the same thing in LA, a bigger market, right? Well, she did have me move out. She did help me find a place. I was actually house sitting for somebody for the most part. But the whole cake idea never really caught on because people in LA just didn't understand it. And I wasn't going to just start all over again making free cakes. So that's when my cake business basically ended, except for the handful of times when I go back to see my family in Philly and I made some cakes for some record promoters or concert promoters like the Rolling Stones or David Bowie. And yeah, I did miss it. And the record promoters missed me and the cakes I used to make. But, everybody understood. Life goes on. Oh, and before I end this chapter on the cakes, I should mention that through the record promoters, their bosses up in New York found out what I did and liked what I did. So a handful of times I made cakes for the record labels in New York City and their shows. For example, Genesis. Phil Collins, I got to meet. One of the nicest artists I ever met. And here's the thing. When I was backstage, it was the most fun and friendliest atmosphere of all times. There was never anything weird. Another thing I'll mention, besides the record label promoters, there were also indie record label promoters that the record labels would hire to promote their records to the radio stations. And these independent promoters had special relationships with radio stations. It was their job to get the record on the air. And when my friend Robin moved out to LA, she was working in the independent record promotion business. They also had them back in Philly, too. Then there was a very short time when there was talk about how these independent record promoters use certain tactics to get records on the air. And just so you know, I worked with some of these people. I never heard anything that would be considered illegal or unscrupulous. So that, my dear listeners, is the true story of my life in cakes, rock, and roll.